Resident Evil has spent the last 30 years chasing a perfect balance between action and survival horror. Along the way, that pursuit brought enormous commercial success, but it also forced Capcom into a cycle of experimentation that repeatedly pushed the series away from its own identity. Resident Evil Requiem is the latest experiment and the most revealing one yet. By separating survival horror and blockbuster action across its characters and gameplay, Requiem drew some skepticism in the lead up to its release, reminiscent of ideas long since tested and rejected. Over 30 years, Capcom has taken major risks with Resident Evil that ultimately led to the loss and revival of the franchise's identity. From the contrasting design of Leon and Grace to the split narrative to the return to Raccoon City, every choice carefully selected from 30 years of lessons learned in balancing these two complementary but competing visions for Resident Evil. This is the story of why Resident Evil Requiem was inevitable. Spanning Resident Evil's 30-year dynasty is a variety of interpretations of the franchise's identity. In the beginning, Resident Evil began as a spiritual sequel to Capcom's horror adventure Sweet Home, and the game that gave birth to survival horror, Alone in the Dark. The first installment was intended as a refinement of the 3D polygonal survival horror genre that Alone in the Dark had instantiated in 1992. Resident Evil 1 is considered a founding pillar of survival horror, a classic in every definition. Fear is interwoven into the game's stressful combat, claustrophobic setting, dark story, and innovative limited inventory management systems. Its breakout success was an elevation of these earlier attempts and reached broader commercial success than expected, an early sign for Capcom to double down on the game and create a sequel. Between 1998 and 2002, Capcom would release a suite of new titles including Resident Evil 2, 3, Code Veronica, and Zero. The strong sales performances of each of these games was thanks to the notoriety of the series and the high bar that Capcom had set for delivering a market-leading survival horror experience. Each entry sold in the millions, dramatically outpacing other contemporary titles in the genre and hanging with some of the biggest mainstream games during this era. However, at the turn of the millennium, Resident Evil's sales numbers began to decline with Code Veronica and Zero, both not achieving the commercial breakthrough that Capcom were hoping for. These two titles were firmly focused on delivering a grounded survival horror experience with all the bells and whistles that you would expect from fixed camera angles to restricted itemization. For Capcom, decisively leaning into the horror roots of Resident Evil was, commercially at least, not yielding the intended outcome, so something had to change. At the time, new games had come onto the market that were showing extraordinary adoption from consumers, predominantly the rise of the first-person shooter genre through games like Halo Combat Evolved, Half-Life, and Call of Duty. For Capcom, the equation was very simple: more action, more money. But could they pull off an action-focused game without sacrificing the core horror experience that Resident Evil was known for? In short, yes. Resident Evil 4 was such a startling success, both critically and commercially, that for many, it isn't just considered the best survival horror game of all time, it's considered the best game of all time, period. Within its first few years, the game sold over 3 million copies across the GameCube and PS2, even receiving the Guinness World Record for best-selling survival horror game in 2012. So to say that Capcom's gamble on a more action-focused Resident Evil game was a success would be an understatement of biblical proportions. Within the walls of Capcom, the strategy had been set. They were doubling down on action, but they were going bigger next time, in budget and action. Following 4's success, Resident Evil 5 would reach even greater commercial heights. Its March 2009 launch, despite the controversy surrounding its release, sold upward of 5 million units by May of that same year across both the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions, a truly remarkable number for a title in this genre. But Resident Evil 5 was an unquestionable step away from survival horror. In fact, it's hard to claim it was survival horror at all. Resident Evil 5 dropped the pretense and was Capcom's most decisive statement that action was the future of the series. The grand budget that they threw at its development was in the interest of competing with its contemporary shooter competition, and it couldn't be argued that the investment hadn't paid itself back enormously. So why not even go bigger on budget and badder on action with the next one? Resident Evil 6 took the path of its predecessor, but dialed it up even further, bigger in every way. Across its 4 campaigns, there were varying degrees of fear-inducing moments, but none sufficient enough to not be dubbed with the label of action shooter rather than survival horror by fans and critics, and neither were particularly happy with the outcome. Fan frustrations focused on the game's divergent stories that felt too separate to meaningfully converge and created a frustrating narrative experience that drew some deserved ire toward the game. Its mixed critical reception impacted its sales numbers and thus failed to meet Capcom's forecasts. This, in conjunction with the game's inflated budget, meant that for Capcom, Resident Evil 6 was a costly gamble. Action, while providing the franchise with its broad appeal, had begun to erode the foundations of what differentiated Resident Evil in the first place. Resident Evil 6 was a clear indicator that there could be too much of a good thing. To keep pace with the trending action-first games that the franchise was attempting to compete with, the size of the investment was simply unsustainable, compounded with the fading of the popularity of the horror genre in gaming as 2012 came to a close. Capcom were forced to shelve the mainline games in search of a better path forward, one that deviated from their current trajectory. As the new year began in 2014, Capcom were ready to take the next step with Resident Evil. This moment in time was a critical juncture in the reputation of the game. Another misstep and the franchise may lose its trust with its fans. Resident Evil had, for better or worse, lost a core piece of its identity, namely survival horror. The foundation that had been set nearly 2 decades ago. Capcom needed someone to bring the soul of the series back and define what Resident Evil was once more. But of the many veterans that were still in the company, who was truly equipped to light a fire under the franchise? In January of 2014, Jun Takeuchi, famed for his prolific influence on the franchise, had been tasked with the role of executive producer on the next mainline installment, Resident Evil 7. Having been with the series since the very beginning, Takeuchi knew that to revive the franchise, he needed to take it back to its roots, where fear and terror were synonymous with the name Resident Evil. In fact, Takeuchi outrightly stated in a making-of documentary that Resident Evil 1 was a primary inspiration for Resident Evil 7.
私、バイオハザード1の開発も携わっていたんですが、やはりバイオハザード1の時はいかにプレイヤーに近い距離で恐怖を感じてもらえるかっていうところを重視して作っていた。あの当時の感覚をもう一度思い出すっていう作業に近かったと思います。今回はそこの切り替えっていうよりは自分の頭を1990年代にグッと戻すっていうようなイメージで取り組みました。
His first task was to put together a team capable of delivering his new vision for a survival horror first game. For the position of director, he looked no further than Koshi Nakanishi, who had delivered Revelations, a well-received spin-off title that played into the traditional survival horror experience akin to earlier games. Nakanishi was given 2 directives: bring horror back to the forefront and design the game around the motif of the Evil Dead. This could have been interpreted in many ways. To Nakanishi, this meant a singular environment that was isolated, unforgiving, and intimate, with a cast of characters limited in scope, only exploring a handful with focus and depth. Takeuchi felt that to properly achieve this vision of a survival horror-centric revitalization of the franchise, a first-person perspective would be critical to capture the suffocating tone of a core horror experience. From the game's producer, Masachika Kawata, after we made the decision, it was, what do we need to do in order to make sure that we're able to offer the player the ultimate horror experience? That was what led to the decision of going from the third-person perspective to first-person perspective. We figured this would be the best way of allowing player immersion. In terms of characters, we figured, let's not have previous characters make an appearance. Lead characters really blend in better with the survival horror aspects when we're able to allow the player to empathize with this really average character. This change to a first-person perspective was unquestionably a risk, as it was a very large departure from the third-person perspective that had become synonymous with Resident Evil and survival horror more broadly, a risk that even today is still considered controversial for a portion of the fanbase. Selling this new concept was the dev team's first challenge. How do you convince a broad set of stakeholders in Capcom that a true horror experience was the right direction for the series to take? The team put together a short concept film to capture the tension-filled and isolating tone that had initially excited the dev team, a new format that put the player in the scene rather than sitting over the shoulder of a capable combat-trained professional. Needless to say, the concept film was very convincing. The singular vision for a stripped-back, simple and yet elegant distillation of spine-chilling terror filled executives and developers from across Capcom with a sense of excitement. Nakanishi was rewriting the book on embodying a survival horror protagonist, throwing everything at creating one of the most immersive atmospheres that the industry had ever seen. This included taking graphical fidelity to a whole new level, with photorealism and environmental accuracy being a key driver to ensure that players felt as empathetic and connected to the terrifying ordeal that Ethan Winters would be going through. The team went on both domestic and international excursions to capture highly detailed assets to reference for the game's environments and tone. This was no pristine, high-class manor filled with ornate puzzles. It was a time-weary mansion in the enigmatic bayou of Louisiana, and that was by design, a relatable, realistic location where anyone could one day potentially find themselves. To add to that sense of realism, the characters of Resident Evil 7 were carefully designed by Muramasa Sato, the game's scenario director, to have a monstrous presence that was tonally cut through by their humanity. While Mr. X and Nemesis were terrifying in their own right, there's a primal uncomfortability that is triggered when Jack Baker chases you around his family home, speaking to you in your own language, hinting at the humanity that this imposing entity has now lost. It is these remnants of humanity that make the Baker family and the disturbing acts they commit throughout the game that much more horrifying. These monsters act like humans, toying with your own sensibilities of the way that humans should behave. When Resident Evil 7 launched on the 24th of January 2017, its critical reception was overwhelmingly positive. Its bold experiment with the Resident Evil formula was well received by a large portion of the fanbase and the gaming community at large. It was strongly positioned as a modern classic, taking a decisive step forward for the survival horror genre and redefining the immersiveness that could be achieved with modern hardware across consoles, PC, and VR. Despite its critical success, Resident Evil 7 initially fell short of Capcom's sales targets of 4 million units, but by the end of its debut year had sold through 5 million copies. Today, Resident Evil 7's lifetime sales is north of 16.4 million, but its uptake was gradual compared to breakouts like Resident Evil 5. Underlying all the success was a reasonable share of criticism and attrition when it came to the game's accessibility. Resident Evil 7 was, while unquestionably brilliant, flawed. While the game was criticized for its inconsistent third act and Ethan Winters' lack of character development, there was one other factor that influenced its slower success in the market. Resident Evil 7 was scary. Really f***ing scary. And while this was also the source of its lasting legacy as a modern survival horror classic, it did also alienate consumers. Many felt that its daunting fear was too much for them to want to experience it for themselves. Rightly or wrongly, this was the market reaction that Capcom would fixate on as their attention turned to the next mainline game. Capcom would come back to their prior conundrum. Having now tested both limiting cases of the Resident Evil experience, extreme action and extreme horror, the publisher decided once more to take a conservative approach to Resident Evil 8. The word accessible was a common theme in discussions as initial designs began to take shape. In the words of the game's producer, Tsuyoshi Kanda, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard very much reflected a genuine effort to go back to our roots and create a title that evoked the level of fear offered by the first installment of the franchise. The positive reception we received after it launched was incredibly validating, and the development team as a whole was both relieved and very happy. At the same time, we also heard some fans say that the game was too scary. We want Resident Evil to be accessible to as many people as possible, so Resident Evil Village did take on a more action-oriented approach. Absorbing the successful components of Resident Evil 7 meant a few things: keeping the first-person perspective, continuing to pursue the mold arc, utilizing the RE engine responsible for Resident Evil 7's graphical immersion, and focusing on a survival horror experience. While they were dialing in the terror-inducing DNA, it was a centrally important design pillar of the resultant game, which the developers characterized as a struggle to survive. Capcom were aiming to experiment with more flexibility around the player's fear. In designing the game's difficulty settings, these modes were reframed as options to tune the emotional experience, as opposed to a pure refinement of player challenge, an experiment to allow players to select their tolerance for fear in the hopes of appealing to a broader market. From the trailer's first reveal, one thing was inherently obvious. Resident Evil 4 was a core inspiration for the game. Its isolated village in the middle of a European landscape populated by infected villagers felt familiar, yet fresh in its presentation, but it would be reductive to say that Resident Evil Village was purely an action-focused game. It was action-focused, even dominantly so, but mainly in certain stages of its level sequencing. Its opening hours and the House Beneviento falling squarely in the definition of a survival horror experience, but weighed against the later stages of the game where Ethan's arsenal was so extensive that action becomes front and center. And this actually was by design. The concept is a horror theme park with characters that stand out against this beautifully rendered environment. The stages cycle between horror and action to help the players stay balanced. That's something we learned from other Resident Evil games. When Village launched on May 7th, 2021, it was met with a mostly positive reception. It was unquestionably a good game, a compelling setting, memorable villains, tight combat, and thoughtful level design, but it certainly wasn't perfect either. Critics and fans reacted to the game well, but similarly to prior games, there was an evident disambiguation of the game's identity. While the horror theme park concept was conceptually interesting, it translated to a somewhat confused gameplay experience. It lacked the simple elegance that Resident Evil 7 had aimed for. In scaling that experience up and driving more action into its DNA, it lost the deep immersion that its predecessor had mastered. Commercially, Village outsold 7, reaching 6 million units in its debut year, where Resident Evil 7 took almost 2 years to achieve the same outcome. Now, this unquestionably was impacted by two other factors that are worth raising. One, between Biohazard and Village, the remakes of 2 and 3 had also been released to commercial success, creating a clean runway for a new mainline game to succeed. And two, the global pandemic that accompanied its release had generated a massive amount of customer spending on digital entertainment. It's worth stating that the Resident Evil 2 remake's overwhelmingly positive critical reception was a further validation that a more traditional survival horror take on Resident Evil was still in vogue for players and brought a new generation of fans to the franchise. Comparatively, the Resident Evil 3 remake's critical reception was distinctly poorer, but despite being a more action-focused iteration, it's hard to use it as a piece of evidence that its faster-paced gameplay was the cause, as the game had an abundance of glaring issues outside of just its action. So looking at the higher sales numbers but slightly lower critical feedback of Village gave Capcom reason to pause. And the attempts at broadening the series' mass appeal worked. Commercially, sure. From a gameplay perspective, maybe, but maybe not. From here, it wasn't entirely clear how they might continue that Sisyphean effort of balancing action and survival horror. Capcom, like many fans, had one thing on their mind as future game releases came into view, or should I say, one man, Leon S. Kennedy. Remarkably, Resident Evil Requiem's development started as far back as the 2019 to 2020 period, meaning that the incredibly successful 2023 remake of Resident Evil 4 and Requiem were both in development alongside each other, Requiem more so post the remake's launch. The Resident Evil 4 remake's release in March of 2023 had sold past 6 million units by December of that same year, making it, at the time, the fastest selling Resident Evil game of all time, reaching universal acclaim from critics and fans alike. It proves something very important, that fans still put this blend of action and survival horror toward the pinnacle of a Resident Evil experience, evidence of market interest that was impossible for Capcom to ignore. So with Requiem now coming into view as the next mainline installment, a solution to Capcom's balance problem was starting to become clearer. As Requiem's development began to heat up, there was a clear desire to bring the story back to its main thread, with Leon driving its events. On the table were a multitude of experiments that Capcom had tested since Resident Evil 7's release in 2017. How do you take the survival horror atmosphere of 7, the tense combat of the remake of 2, the evolution of the first-person combat in Village, and the personality of the 4th installment, and create something that builds on their collective successes? As with each prior title, Requiem was going to be another experiment, in some ways more bold and others more subtle in its approach to refining the formula. You see, Capcom had decided to impart the responsibility of balancing the experience, at least in part, to the player. At face value, you might call Requiem a clashing of worlds, Grace representing the tense survival horror of Resident Evil 7 and Leon the egocentric action blockbuster of Resident Evil 4. And while that's unquestionably true in many aspects, Capcom was going to give you the option to ratchet up fear or reduce it to fit the specific blend that you can best enjoy. First, Requiem permits on-the-fly changes to its first and third-person views. Now, the dev team intends for Grace to be played in first person and Leon in third, but if you so desire, you can switch these perspectives to either have a more or less intimate experience. While the intended horror is still somewhat inescapable, your immersion in it could be tailored to make it less impactful and thus more accessible. Imagine if you could corner peek Jack Baker. It wouldn't have been nearly as terrifying. In pondering this question for themselves, Capcom introduced third person to Resident Evil Village in 2022, and the general consensus was that it definitely lightened the fear in the game, giving Capcom a lever for players to pull. Second, Requiem features multiple modified difficulty settings, most interestingly the casual and standard classic modes. Casual now has a heavy aim assist function that auto aims at enemy weak points to enable players to focus on story and puzzle components of the game. As in the Resident Evil 2 remake, Standard Classic reintroduces the series ink ribbon mechanic that requires access to an ink ribbon in order to save. The former eliminates much of the pressure and panic in the game's claustrophobic combat, and the latter enables even more tension by limiting the number of saves available during your playthrough. Together, these options compounded with a split in the game's pacing between the timid Grace and the indomitable Leon permits Capcom to give some of the agency back to you in how the game will play out, reframing fear as a spectrum, one that can be finely tuned much like an FOV slider in the player menu. There's also nuance in understanding the reasoning behind the split between Grace and Leon's gameplay perspectives. The pillar of the game's design is structured around the concept of addictive fear. In some ways, addictive fear is analogous to the addictive brutality that players experience in overcoming a punishing boss in a From Software game. There's an innate, almost primal response we get when overcoming something difficult. Nakanishi's instinct that fear is that hurdle that we need to vault over is the core principle behind Capcom's decision to bifurcate the gameplay in Requiem. In his words, it's almost like having two games with completely different types of tension mixed together. Early on, we worried players might not be able to keep up, but now we feel that the contrast gives the game a unique rhythm, like jumping into a cold bath after sitting in a hot sauna. It was important to combine the slow and fast segments as well, and Grace and Leon turned out to be the best combination for that. Leon also has a lot of new actions, giving you a strong sense of release compared to Grace's sequences. In early production, Requiem was originally going to focus on an experienced Leon front and center, but early designs felt at odds with his character's legacy. We always thought about making Leon the protagonist, but making a horror game based around him is difficult. He wouldn't jump at something like a bucket falling. No one wants to see Leon scared by every little thing, so he's actually quite a bad match for horror. But the desire to bring Leon back to Raccoon City and place him in this intense survival horror experience was still there, and needed to be offset by a character that would act as a vehicle for player fear, which is where Grace enters the picture. Grace is described by Capcom as a new type of character for the Resident Evil series, but one that is introverted and easily scared, or more directly, the biggest scaredy cat in Resident Evil history. In spite of this description, she also needed the credentials to feel compelling in the universe of the series. A trained FBI operative, she has the gun skill to defend herself and the professional experience to tackle the game's famed puzzles. It's clear that Capcom very finely handcrafted a character that sits incredibly decisively on the knife's edge of credibility versus realism. Capable, yet terrified, credentialized, yet underprepared, strong enough, but just barely human in a universe where humans feel more than their birthright. An experienced Leon, the antithesis of Grace's very design principles. So Capcom, in creating Grace to shoulder the burden of Resident Evil's modern survival horror take, was needed to ensure that these two worlds of action and survival horror would not be at odds with one another. The literal untangling of these interwoven visions means that Resident Evil's modern evolution into survival horror-centered design can exist without the broad market appeal of its action competing unnecessarily for the limelight. So Requiem is, in a sense, an experiment to see if the bold separation of the action horror and survival horror can finally achieve its perfected balance that it has been grappling with for the last 3 decades. The unique flavor of action and survival horror that Resident Evil is founded on has led to its genre-breaking success. Its legacy in gaming royalty is a testament to this complementary blend that Capcom invented nearly 30 years ago. Capcom's desire to reach broad market appeal while preserving the identity of the franchise that has lasted since the early sequels to its debut title. Rightly or wrongly, its experiments in elevating the profile of action gameplay resulted in some of its highest-selling and beloved games, but in doing so, learned that the true Resident Evil experience is one where true horror sits at its core. With decades of experiments with the series formula, Resident Evil Requiem stands as a testament to all that Capcom has learned, a game that flips the entire concept of balance on its head, both through its almost complete thematic separation of survival and action horror, and its desire to put control of that equilibrium into the hands of the player. It is fitting then that it has the title Requiem. The game itself is an artifact of remembrance, not only in its return to the birth of the franchise in Raccoon City and the reckoning that unfolds there, but a reflection on 30 years of Resident Evil, a requiem to one of gaming's most iconic franchises, and the near-eternal struggle that has driven its evolution since its first outing on the outskirts of Raccoon City.